Welcome to a journey through the shadows of the Middle Ages. Tonight we will open the doors that history tried to seal, and we will decipher medieval mysteries that were never solved. These are not theories or tales. They are the whispers of a past that still breathes. Let us begin. The Voynich Manuscript. In a silent vault of the Voynich Library at Yale University rests one of the most baffling enigmas of the Middle Ages. A book that has defied human understanding for more than 500 years. A codex so strange that not even the brightest cryptographers have been able to unravel its secrets. It is called the Voynich Manuscript, in honor of the Polish antiquarian Wilfrid Voynich, who rediscovered it in 1912, although its origins go much further back, to a time when alchemists sought the philosopher's stone and monks copied secrets in candlelit rooms. From the very first page, the manuscript reveals its strangeness. It is written in a completely unknown alphabet, with characters that do not resemble any writing system ever used by any civilization. There are no clear clues to guide us regarding its linguistic origin. The words flow with a strange coherence, as if the author truly knew what they were writing, but used a language that has never been spoken in our world. Some researchers have claimed that the text follows its own grammatical rules, which separates it from mere invented gibberish. What makes the Voynich manuscript an even greater mystery is that it appears to have no spelling mistakes, corrections, or erasures, as if the person who wrote it was completely sure of every line they drew. But the text is only part of the enigma. The illustrations accompanying the pages are just as puzzling and fascinating. There are drawings of plants that do not exist in any known herbal, combinations of leaves, roots, and flowers that could seem real if it were not for the fact that there is no record of them growing anywhere on Earth. Some of these botanical illustrations suggest properties, as if the book were some kind of medical or alchemical treatise, but that hypothesis has never been confirmed. There are also astronomical and zodiacal diagrams that do not entirely match those we know today. Incomplete constellations, fragmented suns, celestial circles that could represent maps of stars, or something else. One of the strangest sections of the manuscript shows naked women, thin and identical in appearance, submerged in strange capsules or bathtubs that connect to each other through winding tubes, as if it were a hydraulic system. Some theories suggest it could be a treatise on fertility or female anatomy, although that assumption is based more on the appearance of the figures than on any real translation of the text. What is disconcerting is that these drawings are made with precision, as if they represented specific technical knowledge, which leaves open the possibility that the author was describing something more complex than mere allegories. For decades, scholars, linguists, cryptographers, and mystery enthusiasts have tried to translate the content of the manuscript. During the Second World War, even experts who had worked breaking Nazi codes tried to decipher it without success. Some came to believe that the book made no sense at all, that it was an elaborate medieval hoax meant to impress or confuse someone, perhaps a wealthy patron. However, modern analyses of the text have suggested that the words follow frequency patterns similar to those of real languages. The repetitions, the distribution of the symbols, and the structure of the text do not behave like a completely invented language without logic. It is as if we are facing a real language that we simply have not discovered or that has been lost in time. Carbon dating of the parchment revealed that the material was produced between 1404 and 1438, during the late Middle Ages. This disproves some theories pointing to a Renaissance or later forgery. The book, therefore, is authentic in terms of its age, and its mystery has endured through the centuries with the same firmness with which it was bound. The author, however, remains a ghost. It has been speculated that it could have been Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan monk reputed to be an alchemist. The Italian physician Giovanni Fontana has also been mentioned, known for combining science, engineering, and magic in his treatises. But there is no solid evidence linking the manuscript to any of these names. And so, if it was not Bacon or Fontana, who wrote it? Some have proposed that it was a secret community that encoded its knowledge to avoid persecution by the Church. Others believe it was the work of a single mind, perhaps touched by genius or madness. Some have even suggested that it could have originated outside our world, an idea that gains traction in more esoteric circles, which see in the manuscript an attempt to communicate with entities from another dimension or even with extraterrestrial civilizations. The mystery has also generated frauds and confusion. Over the centuries, several manuscripts have been presented as the key to deciphering the Voynich, though none has fulfilled that promise. Some have been based on statistical combinations, others on ancient languages such as Hebrew or Nahuatl, and there are even those who have tried to link it to lost languages from Atlantis or Lemuria. All these efforts have failed or have been dismissed for lack of concrete evidence. Still, each failed attempt has only fueled the myth further. The fascination with the manuscript is also linked to its silence. Unlike other encrypted texts, such as Caesar's Code or medieval diplomatic messages, the Voynich has no known key, no entry point. There is no partial translation, no word that has been identified with certainty. We do not even know if it is read from left to right, from top to bottom, or if it is structured in some other way. It is like a sealed box with no visible lock, a riddle that mocks our efforts to understand it. Even today, in the age of artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and data analysis algorithms, the Voynich manuscript remains unbreakable. Linguistic models, advanced statistical techniques, and neural network analysis have been applied, and although some results have shown promise, none has managed to reveal the meaning of the text. The book, untouched by the passage of time and technological progress, continues to resist with the same firmness it has displayed for centuries. And so, the Voynich manuscript remains a haunting testimony of lost knowledge or a language the modern world has completely forgotten. Each time a new researcher delves into its pages, they do so with the hope of being the one to decipher it, of being the mind that manages to hear what the manuscript has been whispering for more than 500 years. But so far, all we have done is contemplate it, like someone observing a stranger's dream written in ink and parchment, knowing that somehow that dream remains awake. The Green Monk of the Vatican. Sometimes the deepest secrets are not buried in lost caves or hidden behind stone doors, but rather carefully archived among golden walls, safeguarded by the absolute silence of those who swore never to speak. In the most restricted corridors of the Vatican, where manuscripts are stored that the public eye will never know, there have been murmurs for centuries about the existence of a character who defies both logic and the chronology of history. He does not appear in the official books, nor is he found in the papal records, and no cult is devoted to him. Yet his figure drags like a shadow in the margins of ancient parchments. They call him the Green Monk. His true name remains unknown, as does his order of origin. The epithet green comes, according to certain manuscript copies, from the color of the tunic he wore, woven with unusual plant fibers and dyed with a natural pigment that has never been replicated. The fabric, according to descriptions, seemed to move with him, as if it were breathing, as if it had a will of its own. This monk, according to unofficial tradition, first appeared in Rome in the 13th century, presenting himself unannounced at the gates of the Vatican on a stormy night. The guards could not explain how he had entered. No one recalled having let him pass. Yet there he was, soaked by the rain, standing in front of the Clementine Hall, with a face that appeared younger than his eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen much, perhaps too much. The most perplexing aspect of his appearance was not his silence or his unusual appearance, but the reaction of the clergy. Upon seeing him, several cardinals paled, and one even fell to his knees, murmuring an ancient prayer that is no longer used. The surviving documents from that era do not mention him directly, but there are side annotations in the margins of private letters that refer to the one who came from the forest of the unnameable, or the bearer of buried knowledge. These expressions are repeated in different languages, in scripts of various hands, which suggests that whoever he was, his presence left an impression so strong that even those accustomed to the most aberrant heresies feared for their spiritual life. The green monk did not speak much, but when he did, his voice was described as a drawn-out murmur, like the wind among the trees or the sound of water falling on old stone. He spoke in a dialect that only the most learned monks in ancient Latin managed to understand partially. The little that has been preserved indicates that he possessed very advanced medical knowledge, especially in the treatment of diseases that at that time were considered divine curses. In texts recovered from the Vatican secret archive, there is reference to his direct intervention during a plague that struck one of the convents near Florence. It is said that he cured 47 monks in 3 days, using a mixture of plants that never grew in Italian lands, and whose botanical description does not correspond to any species classified by Linnaeus centuries later. There are those who claim that this monk had access to forbidden texts, books that the Church had withdrawn from public knowledge for being considered dangerous or blasphemous. Some even link him with the mythical Book of the Serpent, a lost treatise on spiritual alchemy and the manipulation of human consciousness. The existence of this book has been officially denied, but several independent researchers claim to have seen references to it in codices buried in monasteries in Eastern Europe. The green monk, apparently, had read it and spoke of its contents with a clarity that frightened even the most skeptical. Legends about his abilities began to multiply rapidly. It was said that he could heal with his gaze, that his prayers made walls tremble, and that he understood the language of animals. A classified report, kept under strict security in an underground vault, describes how he was interrogated for several weeks by a secret Vatican commission whose objective was to determine whether he was a celestial envoy or a heretical entity. During the interrogations, the monk demonstrated his ability to recite entire passages from texts that were sealed in the apostolic library, sometimes word for word, and then offered interpretations that contradicted the official doctrine, interpretations that later would come to coincide with scientific discoveries yet to be made at that time. The most disturbing element for his examiners was a series of maps he carried with him, drawn by hand on aged parchment, which showed the known world and unknown regions, islands that did not appear in any atlas, mountain ranges that should not exist, and underground paths that, according to his explanation, connected energetic points on Earth as if they were nodes in a living body. One of these maps was secretly reproduced by a young scribe, and for years it circulated as a curiosity among Renaissance scholars, until the Inquisition took charge of erasing every trace of its existence. An element that has allowed his story to persist in the shadows of monastic oral tradition is his disappearance. One morning, he was simply no longer there. There were no signs of struggle nor traces revealing his departure. His cell remained intact, except for a symbol drawn with ash on the wall, an inverted spiral with 5 points surrounding it, an emblem that has sporadically appeared in archaeological sites from ancient cultures with no contact with one another. In some versions of the account, the monks who knew him claimed to have seen him walking toward the forest before dawn, barefoot, as a thick fog swallowed him. He never returned. Over the centuries, his figure has resurfaced in unexpected ways. There are accounts of monks in Germany who saw him in dreams, delivering healing formulas that later proved effective. In the 19th century, during some excavations in the south of France, a reliquary was found containing a small piece of green fabric with traces of an unknown vegetal ink. Inside, there was a fragment of text that coincided with one of the fragments attributed to him. In more recent decades, some occult researchers have linked his figure with pre-Christian Hermetic traditions, suggesting that the green monk was not simply a man, but a kind of messenger, a traveler between worlds who appears when certain knowledge is about to disappear completely. Whatever the case, the Church has never confirmed nor denied his existence. The surviving references are hidden in the personal diaries of bishops, in notes in the margins of liturgical texts, and in letters that were never sent. What does seem clear is that, for those who knew him, his passage was as real as it was unsettling. A testimony collected in the year 1283 sums it up in a phrase that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who reads it in its original context. He did not come from the flesh nor from the dust. He came from the silence that exists before the word. There is something in the story of the green monk that defies oblivion, as if it were part of a memory that does not entirely belong to us, but that watches over us from the oldest folds of time. Perhaps, in some dark corner of the Vatican, his tunic still sleeps. Perhaps, if one listens with sufficient attention among the leaves of a deep forest, one can still hear that whisper that speaks in forgotten tongues, reminding us that there are knowledges that are not lost, they are merely hidden. The Night of 1,000 Names. Among the many figures parading through medieval chronicles, amid crusade heroes, holy war martyrs, and traitors whose heads ended up impaled on spears, there exists a character whose silhouette appears time and again, like an echo passing through the centuries without fading, adopting a different name each time, but always leaving a mark impossible to ignore. He does not belong to any single region or cause. He appears in French documents, English annals, German codices, and even Byzantine records, always linked to extraordinary events, surrounded by mystery, and bearing an identity that shifts as though time itself has no effect on him. In the margins of official knowledge, this figure is known as the Knight of 1,000 Names. What is most unsettling about this knight is not the variety of names he adopted. Some call him Sir Almeric, others von Hohenstaufen, or Guillaume de Chartres, and some refer to him only as the one with the golden helm, but rather the fact that his appearances span decades, even centuries, always with identical details. A dark-coated horse with a white scar on its forehead, a lance adorned with illegible inscriptions, and armor of a design never replicated, with plates seemingly scorched with symbols that belong to no known heraldry. In some accounts, this armor reflected light even in the rain, as if made of a mysterious alloy that medieval iron could never produce. One of the earliest references appears in a Saxon chronicle dated 1148, during a local rebellion. In that version, a foreign knight arrived unannounced at the castle of Tillingham and offered his services as a mediator. Strangely, he spoke perfect Old Saxon, knew the names of the rebel leaders before they were spoken, and after securing a truce, vanished before dawn without a trace. The scribes of the time, prone to exaggeration and mysticism, could not label him a saint or a demon. One simply wrote, "He was not one of ours, nor one of theirs. He was from another time." Decades later, during the Crusades, an identical knight is mentioned again, with the same physical and weapon details, fighting under various banners. A manuscript preserved in the National Library of Jerusalem recounts how, during the capture of a stronghold in Syria, a lone warrior appeared among the Crusaders, fighting with a technique completely foreign to the era, performing movements more akin to Renaissance fencing than medieval combat. Several soldiers claimed he neither ate nor slept, simply remaining silent, sharpening his weapon under the moon. After the victory, he vanished without being seen leaving. Curiously, his figure also appears in Turkish documents from the same period, this time fighting alongside the Seljuks. A contradiction that no historian has managed to explain without venturing into the realm of myth. Some have attempted to explain these appearances with the theory of reincarnation, suggesting he was not the same man, but rather a lineage of warriors inheriting the name, equipment, and mission. Yet that hypothesis crumbles when examining the accounts closely. All describe the same scar on the right cheek, the same deep voice, the same strange symbol engraved on the hilt of his sword, a circular shape with 3 lines pointing to the center, a symbol not found on any other medieval artifact. In the 14th century, during the Black Death, a letter sent by a physician from Avignon mentions a man who traveled through entire villages in armor covered by a dark cloak, delivering a balm that, according to witnesses, cured fever within hours. The doctor describes him as someone ageless, with eyes that were neither young nor old. Those who were healed never fell ill again, but the balm could never be reproduced. A friar who tried to follow the knight died upon entering the forest. In his journal, the last sentence written before his death read, "He does not walk among the living, but he still breathes." The records become denser as we approach the end of the Middle Ages. In Bohemia, during the Hussite Wars, a figure called John the Incorruptible appears in the stories, his physical description matching all previous accounts. He is credited with miracles in battle, superhuman endurance, and strategic knowledge far beyond that of the most seasoned generals. Curiously, reports from both sides recognize him as a key figure in their victories, as if he had been fighting for everyone and no one at the same time. One confused chronicler wrote, "The same face on both fronts, the same footsteps in opposite directions." One of the strangest documents related to this figure was found in a ruined abbey near Lyon. In a parchment rescued from the flames, a monk wrote of witnessing a conversation between the knight and a 10-year-old boy, spoken in a language the monk could not understand. That boy grew up to become a bishop and, according to his own journals, dreamed of the knight every night until his death. On his deathbed, he whispered, "He is the guardian of change, the sentinel of what must not be named." Some modern researchers have tried to gather all these references under a single psychological pattern: the archetype of the unknown savior, a figure who appears in times of crisis with qualities beyond common understanding. However, that symbolic interpretation does not explain how it is possible that, in documents separated by centuries and written in different languages, the same person is described with such precise and consistent physical details. No collective myth can maintain that level of accuracy for so long without being altered or distorted through generations. Of course, there is no shortage of bolder theories. Some claim the Knight of 1,000 Names was or is a time traveler, someone with access to knowledge that allows him to cross eras and blend into the ruins of the past, intervening only when strictly necessary. Others believe he belongs to a secret order whose mission is to preserve certain key moments in human history, preventing disasters or guiding essential decisions without drawing attention. And there are also those who prefer to think he is not human at all, but an embodied entity with a purpose, whose nature escapes our mental categories entirely. Whatever the truth may be, the only certain thing is that each time his name changes, his essence remains. The Knight of 1,000 Names is, perhaps, the most evident crack in the linear facade of time. A crack that has not yet closed, and through which he may still be passing under our very noses, somewhere, waiting for the world to need him again. Because if his story has proven anything, it is that he appears when chaos reaches its darkest point, when the present can no longer stand on its own, and when the future is about to be lost forever. The Hammer of Shadows. In the Chronicles of the North, where memory intertwines with mythology and sagas merge with the lament of icy winds, there exists the legend of a weapon that should never have been forged. A war instrument whose consequences transcended mere physical violence and sank into the darkest corners of the human mind and soul. This object, known as the Hammer of Shadows, was not carved by common hands, nor created to protect or conquer lands. According to the fragments that have survived both fire and oblivion, its purpose went beyond the understanding of kings and blacksmiths. It was a symbol, a tool, a living weapon. The earliest records of this relic appear at the beginning of the 11th century in an incomplete manuscript found in a ruined church in Iceland, although some claim that the true origins of the hammer are far older, so ancient that its story was passed down orally for generations before ever touching parchment. In this text, written in a tense and nervous handwriting, a secret ceremony is described in which several monks, sheltered on the fringes of the Christian world, invoked the shadows from the deep to grant power to an object forged during 7 moonless nights. The one who wielded it, they claimed, would see beyond flesh, beyond life itself. They called it Skuggahamar, which in Old Norse means shadow hammer, although modern translators have struggled to find an exact meaning for that word. What does seem clear is that this hammer was not made to fulfill a traditional military role. It was not wielded in battlefields to break shields or skulls. According to the stories, its power was more subtle, more sinister. When struck against the earth, it could generate a sound that resonated only in the ears of certain men, causing visions, memory loss, prophetic dreams, or even death with no apparent cause. One of the most intriguing accounts comes from a Norwegian codex dated to 1096. The text tells the testimony of a knight who, after joining an expedition into the Black Mountains of the north, discovered a temple-like structure carved directly into the rock. At the center of the site, on an obsidian pedestal, rested the hammer. It was small compared to common weapons of the time, but radiated a presence the witness described as too dense to belong to this world. He claimed the air became thick around it, and the silence was so deep that he could hear his own blood flowing. What followed that discovery seems torn from a fever dream. The knight recounts how one of his companions, upon attempting to grasp the hammer, began to scream in a language no one knew, tearing his throat until he collapsed dead. Another fled in madness and threw himself off a cliff, repeating a word that appears in no living tongue. Only the narrator managed to exit the temple, and even then, he returned marked for life, blind in one eye, hair completely white, and tormented by nightmares that followed him to his grave. The church, although officially silent about this artifact, appears to have been aware of its existence. There are indirect references in records from minor councils discussing the eradication of heretical objects that whisper to men. Some of these texts speak of relics that cause eclipses in the soul, or shatter the line that separates the real from the reflection. During the papacy of Paschal II, one document from the Vatican's secret archive mentions the dispatch of a group of clergymen to the north, with explicit orders to seal a sacred place that darkness has not yet fully claimed. Although the hammer is never mentioned directly, the date coincides with the disappearance of several monasteries near the fjords. Interestingly, in every century, a different version of the hammer seems to reappear, as if its presence manifested under various names and forms, yet always retained the same core traits. In the 13th century, in the region of Bavaria, a friar describes in his personal journal the existence of a black stone mallet, hidden in a grotto guarded by mute monks. According to the text, the weapon had been used by an abbot to stop a plague afflicting the peasants, but the cure was worse than the disease. Although the illness ceased, the fields became barren, and children born after that year did not speak, only muttering nonsense words in their sleep. Later, during the 100 Years' War, a text attributed to a French scribe mentions the passage of a foreign warrior bearing a strangely crafted hammer. He never took part in any battle, but his arrival always coincided with inexplicable truces or with shared dreams among soldiers who claimed to have seen black fire consuming banners without touching them. That man disappeared without a trace, and the hammer was never seen directly, but its shadow appears in the margins of descriptions, like a lurking witness. A common element in all these accounts is the psychological impact the hammer provoked. It was not a weapon that killed physically, at least not immediately. It transformed those who wielded it. Testimonies agree that those who held it began to change. First came insomnia, then alterations in speech and behavior, until they became unrecognizable. Some stopped responding to their names. Others wrote symbols compulsively, unlike anything known. In many cases, the affected simply vanished into the night, as if they had been called somewhere they no longer remained people, but fragments of something else. Today, some claim the Hammer of Shadows still exists, hidden in some forgotten corner of Northern Europe, perhaps buried in the basement of an abandoned church, or guarded by a monastic order still watching over secrets the modern world has chosen to ignore. There are also those who believe it was destroyed by the church itself, melted in ritual, sealed in stone, and thrown into the depths of the North Sea, so it would never again threaten the balance of souls. But there are also those who claim to have seen it in dreams, exactly as it was described centuries ago, as if the object did not need to exist physically to continue its purpose, as if it were enough for someone to remember it for it to keep breathing. The Hammer of Shadows is not just a tool or a legend. It is a fracture in history, a warning carved into the bone of collective memory, an object that defies the very notion of linear reality. Whatever it may be, those who have come too close to it agree on one thing. It is not a weapon to be wielded. It is a burden to be dragged. And every time someone searches for it, even if they never find it, something begins to change. The Nights of Silence. In the vast darkness of the Middle Ages, where military orders sprang up like mushrooms on damp ground and the Crusades drew the borders of faith in blood, there was a brotherhood of which little is spoken, not because they left no trace, but because their story was deliberately torn from the books, silenced by those who understood, too late, the danger of their existence. There are no shields carved with their emblem, no songs that mention them. No official battles name them as heroes, and no pious tales elevate their mission. They were known only by those who crossed their path, and of those, very few lived to tell the tale. They were called the Knights of Silence. This order appears fragmentarily in scattered documents, private letters, marginal notes in chronicles, and especially in the personal journals of religious figures and nobles who, at some point, saw them pass like a dense shadow across the landscapes of 12th century Europe. Their origin is uncertain, although they are linked to border regions between France and the Holy Roman Empire, areas that, at that time, were riddled with heresies, Gnostic sects, and ancient pagan cults hidden in monasteries that did not fully answer to Rome. Some records by early inquisitors refer to a voiceless militia, whose actions were aimed at guarding something that should never be revealed. Unlike other military orders, these knights carried no banners and answered to no kings or popes. They moved in small groups, usually from 3 to 5 members, and wore dark tunics with no visible symbols. Their weapons were simple, short swords, daggers, and what stood out the most, masks covering their faces. Some of these masks were made of iron, others of worked leather with angular shapes, but all shared one trait: the complete absence of features. No eyes, no mouth, no signs of humanity. It was said that beneath those masks were men who could no longer speak, who had voluntarily given up their voices as part of their sacred vow. Silence was not merely a tactic, it was their principle, their way of life. They did not write, did not sign, left no record of their steps. Their appearance was always brief and precise. They arrived without warning, fulfilled their purpose, and vanished as if they had never been there. And that purpose, according to the few texts that dare to mention it, was to recover, seal, or destroy objects, people, or knowledge deemed dangerous, impure, or too ancient to coexist with the new faith. Some attributed to them the task of cleansing the world's memory, as if their duty was not to fight physical enemies, but to prevent certain fragments of the past from surviving. A letter dated 1169, written by a Benedictine abbot from southern Burgundy, mentions the passing of these knights through his monastery. In it, the abbot describes how 3 faceless men entered at dawn, without breaking doors or waking sentries, and went directly to the underground library where the convent's oldest texts were kept. No one guided them, no one let them through, yet they knew where to go. According to the account, they took a manuscript written in Greek and Hebrew that had never been translated, and which spoke of a voiceless presence that walked through the ages. Before leaving, they placed a smooth black stone, clear as glass, on the abbot's desk, which disintegrated at the touch. In his letter, the abbot did not ask for help or express complaint. He only wrote, "We were not the owners of what we kept. They knew it. Now I know it too." Over time, their presence began to be surrounded by reverential fear. Some towns confused them with avenging angels. Others associated them with demons in disguise. They were said to move without leaving footprints, to enter temples unseen, to uncover secrets buried under centuries of dust without asking questions. Some even linked them to the disappearances of certain miraculous relics the church never managed to explain. Sacred objects that simply vanished, no trace of theft, no signs of violence. As if someone had decided the world should no longer have access to them. One of the most disturbing accounts related to these nights comes from a codex lost during the burning of the Montségur library, a Cathar refuge. In it, a young scribe recounts witnessing the burial of what he called a bone box, a kind of sarcophagus carved with unknown inscriptions, sealed underground in a ritual that included the sacrifice of a white deer. That night, according to the text, 5 men cloaked in black robes performed the act. They spoke no words, made no gesture toward the sky. They simply covered the earth, one by one, with the solemnity of someone guarding a secret that must not die. The next morning, the entire village that had witnessed the burial had disappeared. Only the scribe remained, who wrote the testimony and hid it inside a hollow cross, found centuries later by archaeologists who never fully understood its content. Rumors about their immortality began to grow over the years. Not because people said they never died, but because their appearances did not seem bound by time. Documents from the 14th century describe nights identical to those mentioned in the 11th. Same gestures, same masks, same number of members. And although the accounts come from different regions, the similarities are so precise that it is hard to attribute them to mere coincidence or accidental copying. It is as if the order never vanished, as if it had the ability to survive without recruiting or renewal. Some have come to believe they were not ordinary men, but shadows of the men they once were. With the arrival of the Renaissance, many of these stories began to fade. The light of reason sought to erase what darkness had kept for centuries. But from time to time, among the forgotten papers of some parish archive, a note reappears, a drawing, a symbol carved in stone, that reminds the world there was once a time when certain secrets were too great to be known, and that there were those who guarded them with a devotion that bordered on the inhuman. In a forgotten chapel in Navarre, there can still be found an inscription carved in an ancient dialect that says, "We are those who must not be remembered, the guardians of the unspoken, the eyes of silence that sleeps in the stone." No one knows who wrote it, or when. The stone that bears it is out of place, architecturally speaking, as if it had been placed there not by a builder, but by someone who needed to leave a message for the future. The Nights of Silence remain, to this day, a disturbing enigma. They were not heroes or martyrs. They did not seek glory or recognition. They moved among shadows, protected something we perhaps should never have tried to understand, and disappeared without leaving heirs. Perhaps they still exist, walking among us, in nameless monasteries, in pathless mountains, in churches where no one prays. Perhaps they are simply waiting for someone to dig up what they buried. And when that happens, they will return. Without speaking, without looking back, without letting anything survive them. The bells of the abyss. There are sounds that embed themselves in memory like an invisible claw. Notes that cannot be erased even as time passes, and reason tries to disguise them as dreams or inventions born of exhaustion. During the Middle Ages, when the days were short and the nights seemed endless, villages built their churches like lighthouses of protection in the midst of darkness, trusting that their stone walls and bell towers would be enough to keep away the things that could not be named. However, there were places where the bell towers themselves became a threat, where the bells, instead of announcing salvation or rituals, began to ring from the bowels of the earth, as if someone had buried them beneath the foundations of the world. The elders called these phenomena the bells of the abyss. The first documented account comes from a forgotten village in northern Italy at the beginning of the 12th century. An anonymous chronicler, probably a wandering monk, wrote that in the church of St. Macarius, the parishioners began to hear bells that hung from no visible place. They always rang at the same hour, when the sun began to lean and the light cast shadows longer than the bodies. At first, the sound was faint, almost like an echo, but as the days passed, it became clearer, more defined, until it was impossible not to hear it. The parish priest ordered the tower to be inspected repeatedly, convinced that some mischievous boy had hidden there, but no one was ever found. And most puzzling of all, the bells in the tower were intact, still, without moving even a millimeter. The situation worsened when some townspeople began to behave strangely. A blacksmith known for his physical strength collapsed during one of the masses, claiming to have heard voices within the tolling. Words spoken in a language he did not know but understood as if they came from within himself. An old woman was found wandering naked in the forest, murmuring fragments of psalms mixed with nonsensical phrases, and a child who had never spoken began to sing a perfect melody, exactly matching the bell pattern, though no one had ever taught it to him. The church was closed months later, when the sound persisted even after the bells were physically removed from the belfry and buried. A desperate attempt to break the cycle. It did not work. The tolling continued, though with a new tone, deeper, slower, as if it had descended further. The bishop of the region sent 3 exorcists, but only one returned, and his testimony was so confused it was deemed unfit for ecclesiastical record. He spoke of a descent, of tunnels not shown in the church's blueprints, of stone doors opening toward a place where the sound had no origin, but will. Years later, similar events began to repeat in other regions of Europe. At the Abbey of Dreux, in France, the monks recorded that for 3 consecutive winters, the nightly prayers were interrupted by a tolling that came from underground. One of the novices, unable to bear the sound, tore out his eardrums with a wooden spoon and wrote on the wall of his cell, with his own blood, the phrase, "The abyss does not call, it sings." The abbey was eventually closed and converted into a warehouse, but those who lived nearby claimed that during certain moons, one could still hear the sound by pressing an ear to the stones of the south wall. In many of these churches, later investigations revealed something unsettling. All had been built over natural caverns, deep cracks that, according to geology, had no exit but seemed to breathe, to expand or contract with the seasons. Some modern theories have tried to explain the phenomenon as the result of underground echoes, tectonic movements, or structural resonances. But nothing explains how such a clear musical sound could be produced with hourly precision, much less how it managed to influence the human mind so directly. Because the true terror of the bells of the abyss was not their sound, but what they caused in those who listened to them for too long. Some fell into trances, repeating prayers in lost languages, scratching symbols into the walls with their fingernails, or suffering nightmares so intense their hearts could not withstand the shock. In Germany, a medical record from the 14th century mentions an epidemic of collective auditory hallucination in a convent in Bavaria. 32 nuns claimed to hear a bell calling them by name, one by one. Several died in their sleep, with expressions of ecstasy or utter panic. No autopsy could determine a clear physical cause. Some researchers of the time, aware that something out of the ordinary was happening, began to gather patterns, to search in ancient texts for similar references. That was when they came across an inscription in archaic Latin in a Visigoth chapel that had been abandoned centuries earlier. The rough translation read, "The eternal sound comes neither from God nor man. It is the memory of what was before, calling from below." This discovery, ignored by most official historians, was carefully archived by a group of scholarly monks who believed these bells were not mere acoustic manifestations, but signs of something much older than Christianity itself. A resonance from a pre-human past, from a consciousness imprisoned underground. In some cultures prior to Roman rule, similar legends already existed. Certain Celtic peoples spoke of the call of the stones, and Slavic tribes told stories of caves where the echo held persuasive power. Even in non-canonical Hebrew traditions, there is mention of a mouthless lament, rising from the world's depths, heard only by those on the edge of madness or ecstasy. It seems this phenomenon was older than any religion, but only became dangerous when humans decided to build sacred places directly over the spots where it resonated. The cases began to diminish with the arrival of the 17th century, when many of these churches were destroyed. By wars, by fire, or by direct orders of bishops who did not want to risk inheriting the burden of that curse. However, in some rural areas, the legend persists. In Balkan villages, some claim that during certain eclipses, one can hear a dry, long chime, seeming to rise from the earth itself. There are no recordings, and when someone tries to capture the sound, all that is obtained is a deep hum that distorts devices. Elders advise against going down into the crypts on those days, or praying with your ears open. In the present, the subject has become part of the folklore of deep Europe. But those who have studied the records, who have read the testimonies of desperate monks and tracked the fragments of suppressed texts, know that behind the story lies a warning, that there are places where the earth is not empty, where what was sealed away is not asleep, only waiting for the moment to be heard again. The bells of the abyss were not metaphors or medieval exaggerations. They were the sonic trace of something hidden, something that vibrates beneath us like a taut string, waiting to be plucked. And when it is, no instrument will be needed to transmit the message. Silence will be enough. Listening will be enough. The Book of the Dead Tongues. In the forgotten margins of medieval knowledge, where faith and fear were easily confused, there existed a manuscript that was never meant to be understood by everyone. A book shrouded in mystery since its first mention, whose fragments, scattered like the ruins of a broken truth, still send shivers down the spines of those who dare to study them. It was called the Book of the Dead Tongues, not because it was written in one or two lost languages, like so many other ancient texts, but because its pages were filled with dozens of tongues that no longer belonged to the world of the living. Languages that had not been spoken for centuries or that, according to some, had never been uttered in this plane of existence. What little is known for certain about this book comes from scattered references, marginal notes in forgotten codices, and barely whispered mentions in catalogues of abbeys reduced to ashes. The most complete copy that is known to have existed was apparently held in a Benedictine scriptorium somewhere in the south of Bohemia, hand-copied by a monk, whose identity remains hidden behind a pseudonym that appears only once. Frater Silentius. According to later accounts, that monk had gathered texts found in Roman ruins, forgotten crypts, sealed caves, and manuscripts from extinct cultures, compiling all those fragments into a single volume that defied the rules of time, logic, and comprehension. The manuscript was described by a Florentine traveler in the 14th century as a massive book, with a black cover and metallic edges corroded by something more akin to saltpeter than rust. Inside were over 200 sheets of parchment, each written in at least 4 different languages, arranged in columns or interwoven without any apparent pattern. The reader was faced with a page where Sumerian coexisted with Etruscan, Coptic with ancient variants of Aramaic, Akkadian with inscriptions that still have not been identified as belonging to any known earthly language. But more baffling than the variety was the fluency with which the phrases intertwined, as if forming a single discourse that transcended the boundaries of each language. Scholars who attempted to translate the text claimed that each language seemed to complement the others, as if each word only made sense when read alongside its equivalent in another language. A kind of multilingual code, impossible to break without mastering all those tongues, many of which had been lost for centuries. Some fragments suggested that the book spoke about the origin of language itself. as if trying to reconstruct the primordial tongue which, according to certain mystical texts, was destroyed after the fall of the Tower of Babel. Other fragments seem to list ritual formulas, invocations, or anatomical descriptions of creatures impossible to classify. There were also maps, but not of physical territories. They appeared to reflect ideas, emotions, or philosophical concepts represented graphically. One of the most disturbing elements for readers was that the text seemed to change over time. Several readers claimed that upon returning to a page they had already read, some words had shifted, others had disappeared, or new ones had appeared without explanation. A prior from the convent of Kremsmünster in Austria recorded in his personal diary that the book responded to the reader, adapting its content to unspoken questions. The manuscript seemed to know who was reading it, what they were searching for, and how far they were willing to go. That is why many began to consider it dangerous, not because of what it said directly, but because of what it subtly implied without ever saying it outright. During the height of inquisitorial repression, the book was denounced as heretical, not due to anti-Christian content, but because it led to a loss of sense. It was said that those who read it for many hours began to speak in languages they did not know, to compulsively write in repetitive symbols, to murmur incomprehensible phrases in their sleep. A testimony preserved in the Episcopal Archive of Mainz describes the case of a young monk who, after weeks of studying the text, carved a series of symbols into the walls of his cell using a knife, forming a circle of continuous writing, without spaces, which took months to erase. The monk died without speaking again, but his gaze, according to those who cared for him, was never the same. In a letter from the year 1353, sent to the Pope by a Hungarian-born bishop, the partial destruction of the manuscript is mentioned, carried out by papal order. However, it is also acknowledged that certain pages were claimed by members of an unknown order, described only as the custodians of the last word. There is no official record of them, except for vague mentions in later documents linking them to other vanished texts, such as the supposed Gospel of Silence or the Treatise of the Unpronounceable Name. It is believed that the surviving fragments of the original book were divided and hidden in different monasteries, with instructions that they never be brought together again. Centuries later, during the Ottoman expansion, several of those monasteries were plundered or destroyed, and some lost texts resurfaced in old book markets, mistaken for grimoires or alchemical treatises. One such page, preserved in the Library of Prague to this day, contains a fragment written in Ugaritic, ancient Greek, and an as yet unidentified language. It apparently describes a process of decomposition of the word as a way to reach a higher state of consciousness. What that means is still a topic of debate among philologists, historians of esotericism, and scholars of mystical linguistics. There are rumors linking this manuscript to the Nag Hammadi library, where Gnostic texts of great complexity were discovered. Some independent researchers have suggested that partial copies or reinterpretations of the Book of the Dead Tongues might be hidden among the documents found in Egypt. However, none have found the multilingual structure described in the medieval sources, leading many to believe that the original manuscript, or at least its complete form, is still lost, or remains hidden in the hands of an organization that understands the value of its silence. Interest in the book has not waned over the centuries. In recent years, cryptographers, theologians, and anthropologists have attempted to digitally recreate the writing pattern described in ancient records, hoping to find logic in its chaos. Some artificial intelligence models, trained on thousands of ancient texts, have managed to produce sequences that imitate the manuscript's style, but not its content. As if the words could be mimicked, but the soul of the book remained elusive, conscious, inaccessible. The Book of the Dead Tongues was not merely a linguistic experiment or a collection of fragmentary knowledge. It was, or is, a bridge between forgotten languages and truths that were never clearly spoken. Its existence raises questions about the limits of human understanding, about the origins of speech and thought, and about the possibility that there may be something beyond what we can pronounce. Something that remains hidden, waiting to be read by someone with the courage to lose themselves in its silence. Because not all books were written to be understood. Some were written to remind mankind that there are things which, once spoken, cannot stop echoing. The Faceless Child. Sometimes, horror does not need monsters or shadows moving through the mist. Sometimes, all it takes is something still, silent, something that simply does not belong in this world, something that should not be, and yet is. The tale of the Faceless Child is one of those mysteries that escape any explanation, because it is not based on superstition or overly elaborate legends. Rather, it is one of those stories that emerge from the margins of ecclesiastical records, from the yellowed journals of rural convents, between the lines of text that would have preferred to be forgotten. The first record mentioning his existence dates back to the year 1274 in a Benedictine convent on the outskirts of Verdun, in the Lorraine region of France. It is a brief, almost hidden note in a codex unrelated to creatures or miracles. Among a list of daily tasks, the prior of the convent wrote in a different, tighter hand a phrase that, at first glance, would go unnoticed. The child has arrived. He does not speak. He does not eat. He does not see. And yet, he knows we are here. The full account, however, appears years later, when one of the brothers in charge of the kitchen, a man named Matthew, decides to document what occurred during the 12 years that being inhabited the monastery. The manuscript only partially survived, but what remains is enough to understand the magnitude of the confusion caused by that child. According to the Chronicle, he appeared one winter morning in the middle of a snowfall that had left the fields completely white. A monk who went out to cut wood saw him, standing beside a tree, covered only by a tattered tunic, without footwear, without shelter, without any footprints around. His skin was pale like wax, and the most disturbing thing was his face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing. It was not a wound, nor a malformation, nor a mask. It was simply a smooth surface, as if nature had stopped halfway and decided to leave him unfinished. Despite this, the child seemed to orient himself without trouble, walked firmly, and somehow understood everything happening around him. At first, the monks saw him as a divine punishment or a fallen angel. Some suggested abandoning him, convinced that his presence would bring misfortune. But it was the abbot who decided to accept him, guided perhaps by a kind of compassion that bordered on fear. They gave him a separate cell, clean clothes and food, although he never ate anything. He remained seated for hours, motionless, as if listening to things others could not hear. What was strange was that, despite his silence and his featureless face, the other monks felt his presence with overwhelming intensity. Some said that when they passed by him, they felt their minds stir, as if an old memory had been torn away. Others avoided looking directly at him, although there were no eyes to look back. The most baffling part was discovering that he understood prayers, commands, and even thoughts. It was enough for someone to think of him for him to appear exactly where he was needed. He did not communicate, but he always responded. He did not sleep, but never seemed tired. He was not violent, nor did he show signs of malice, but everyone knew there was something about him that defied all explanation. During the second year of his stay, strange events began to occur. An elderly monk who had spent years writing about theology suffered a kind of mental breakdown after spending the night praying near the child. In his delirium, he claimed to have seen the truth before the world and repeated endlessly that the child does not come from where we are born, but from where we end. He was confined to the infirmary, where he died days later without regaining sanity. Another monk, younger, claimed to have dreamed of a place devoid of light, where the child walked among columns of bones, pointing with his invisible hand to words carved into the air. The abbot himself began to deteriorate over the years. Although he never publicly expressed fear or regret, his writings reveal that the child's presence became an obsession. In one of his final journals, he refers to the child as the bearer of the void, and affirms that he came to the convent not by mistake nor abandonment, but because someone needed to keep him, as if his mere existence posed a threat that had to be contained. By the 10th year, the changes in the monastery became evident. Daily life became more ritualistic, more tense. There was less talking, more praying. Several brothers abandoned their habits and fled without explanation. One of them left a note in ancient Latin accusing the child of being the memory of what flesh cannot utter. The strangest thing was that none of those who left could clearly remember his face once they were outside the convent. They claimed to have seen a figure, a presence, but when they tried to describe it, their words became vague, confused, as if something erased their memories each time they tried to approach the truth. The last record of the child appears in a letter sent to another monastery, written by a new prior after the previous abbot died suddenly. In it, the prior requests guidance on how to act in the face of a formless presence that has surpassed every attempt at spiritual containment. No known response exists. What followed is that, months later, a fire consumed the monastery. No one caused it. There were no signs of attack. 7 monks died. 3 disappeared. Only one survived. Matthew, the same one who left the account. He was found days later, wandering along a rural path, with no memory of the last few years, a cross of ash marked on his forehead. The Faceless Child was never mentioned again. Neither was he acknowledged by the church as a miracle, nor a curse. Most documents that mentioned him were suppressed or classified. Yet, in certain old convents, there are still symbols on the walls, faceless drawings, carved by hands not seeking to create art, but to leave a warning. Today, researchers who have heard of the case attribute it to local invention, historical distortion, or an extreme case of collective hysteria. But those who have read the original documents, the fragments still hidden in private libraries or forgotten crypts, agree on one detail impossible to ignore. All of them, without exception, claim the child's description was accurate, identical across texts that were never connected. A smooth, featureless face, a gaze without eyes, a presence that seemed to carry with it a fragment of another world. The Faceless Child was, perhaps, the crack in reality we were never meant to look at directly. He did not arrive by chance, was not abandoned, and was not lost. He came to remind us that not everything walking among us has an origin we can trace, nor a destiny we can comprehend, and that there are forms of existence that need neither language nor face to leave an indelible mark, the castle that never appears on maps, in the damp valleys that separate old Normandy from the highlands of Brittany, between roads blurred by fog and forests where moss covers even the stones that time has forgotten, hides one of the most persistent and bewildering mysteries of the Middle Ages. It is not a creature, nor a secret sect, not even a cursed object. It is a place, a castle that, according to scattered testimonies and semi-hidden chronicles, once existed, was inhabited, was feared, and yet it never appeared on any map, in any official record, on any known route. A castle that simply was not where it should have been when someone tried to find it. The first clear reference to this castle appears in a letter from the year 1142, written by a cloth merchant who was traveling from Rennes to Caen. In his account, he mentions having been caught in a storm and seeking shelter in a valley where he found a great walled construction surrounded by ancient trees and absolute silence. He was received by silent servants, fed, and placed to sleep in a room that, according to him, had no windows, yet the sound of crows could be heard as if they were inside the walls. Upon waking, the castle had vanished. Not a single stone remained. Only the open field, soaked by the rain, with a stillness that chilled his blood. At first, these types of stories were dismissed as fantasies of exhausted travelers or tavern tales. However, the disturbing part began when more testimonies emerged, separated by decades and considerable distances, all describing a similar structure. A fortress with slender towers, walls of blackened stone, with banners that did not belong to any known feudal lord. Some saw it from afar at dawn, before the light had fully risen. Others claimed to have slept under its roof, although they could not clearly recall how they had arrived or how they had left. It always disappeared. It always faded away. A manuscript from the 13th century, partially preserved in the library of Rouen, makes direct mention of this place. In it, a young monk recounts his journey as a traveling scribe, and how, after getting lost along unmarked paths, he was guided by a hooded figure to a structure he describes as an old stone castle that seemed to have been forgotten even by the trees surrounding it. He claims to have been received by an old man dressed in robes he did not recognize, who asked him to transcribe certain fragments of a text written in a language that, although similar to Latin, contained words that gave him chills as he read them. During his stay, no other face was seen, and the nights were so silent he could hear his own heartbeat. When he finished the task, he was escorted out by the same old man. When he looked back, the castle was gone. Perhaps the most chilling part of the case is not the constant disappearance of the place, but the fact that all those who claim to have seen it agree on something fundamental. No one finds it by looking for it. Everyone finds it when they are lost, alone, wounded, or confused. It is as if the castle itself decides when and to whom it will appear, as if it is aware of its own existence, as if it is less a physical structure and more an entity unto itself, hidden between the folds of the world, appearing only when the veil between the visible and the hidden becomes thinner. During the 100 Years' War, some English soldiers marching toward the Breton coasts reported having seen a fortress from the hills. Thinking it was an enemy position, they sent out a reconnaissance group. The men who left never returned. When the rest of the battalion approached, they found nothing. Only a clearing covered in ash, with no signs of battle, no remains of a camp. One of the captains, according to a letter preserved in the archives of London, wrote in despair, "There is no stone, no wall, no tower. Only the echo of a presence we should never have awakened." Later, in the 15th century, a map made by a Flemish cartographer presents a curious anomaly. Among the hills of northern Brittany, there appears a nameless circular shape, as if it had been drawn and then crossed out with a quill dipped in diluted ink. At the foot of that stain is an inscription that, translated from Old Dutch, reads, "Where the day does not settle and the night does not advance." It has not been possible to confirm what he meant by that, but the cartographer disappeared the following year during an expedition to verify certain anomalies in his own drawings. Attempts to deliberately find the castle have failed time and again. In the 18th century, a group of historians sponsored by a Parisian nobleman spent weeks traveling the routes where sightings were supposedly reported. They camped in the designated spots, used compasses, studied stars, and searched for physical signs that would confirm the passage of previous travelers. They found absolutely nothing, except for a loose stone with an inscription in poorly written Latin that said, "If you seek it, you will not see it. If you fear it, it will find you." Some have suggested that it is a collective illusion, a psychological phenomenon induced by fatigue or superstition. Others have gone further, theorizing that the castle is an interdimensional structure, a node between realities that manifests only under specific conditions. Some more eccentric voices claim it is the result of a failed alchemical experiment, a construction that was never completed in the physical world and that now drifts between planes, appearing when someone is close enough to breaking. Whatever the truth may be, what is certain is that its trace is scattered across more than 5 centuries of documents, testimonies, personal accounts, and veiled references. It appears in medieval folk songs, in unsigned engravings, in visions reported by hermits. A fortress with no banner, that answers to no calendar, and that, in some way, remains present in a place that no one can pinpoint with certainty. Its door, if it truly exists, does not open with keys, nor with prayers, nor with maps. It opens with loss, with solitude, with surrender. The castle that never appears on maps is not a cartographic error nor a myth invented to frighten travelers. It is a reminder that the world is not fully charted, that there are still places where logic bends, where time is not a straight line, and where something, or someone, watches from the invisible, waiting for the next traveler who dares to get lost. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing is not what one finds at the end of the road, but what finds them. The Order of the Forgotten Bones. In the dusty corners of history, where official chronicles choose to remain silent and parchments have been carefully torn to hide what was once written, there are names that survive not because they are repeated, but because their mere mention causes a shiver that transcends centuries. Among these names, one has endured like a shadow that roams abandoned cloisters and cemeteries without crosses. The Order of the Forgotten Bones, a clandestine brotherhood that, according to the scattered traces that escaped burning and oblivion, had a mission as disturbing as it was dangerous: to unearth the remains of saints, martyrs, and wise men, not to venerate them, but to extract from them a knowledge that, according to their belief, lay dormant in the bone, waiting to be released. The first concrete reference to this order comes from a letter dated 1191, written by a bishop of Limoges. The missive, addressed to the abbot of Cluny, mentions with alarm the desecration of a tomb in the crypt of St. Gervasius, whose remains had been removed with surgical precision, as if the thieves knew exactly what to look for. The bishop accuses a nameless brotherhood, dressed in ash-colored habits, who neither pray nor sing, only dig, although he never refers to them directly as a recognized order. From there, the term osibus absconditis began to circulate in the margins of certain ecclesiastical documents, always surrounded by strike-throughs and hurried notes. What was unsettling was not so much the theft of bones, a sadly common practice in a time when relics were traded as amulets of power, but the precise pattern with which they acted. They did not take entire bodies. They extracted femurs, ribs, fragments of skulls, but never the complete skeleton. They did so silently, leaving no visible trace of entry, and always returned the remains that, according to them, did not contain the correct imprint. The crypts remained intact, except for the slight detail of a symbol carved into the stone, almost imperceptible. 3 curved lines intertwined like spiraling snakes, a sign never recognized by any official order. Over the years, some texts began to suggest that these men, because in all the accounts they are always described as hooded figures, tall and thin, walking ceremoniously, believed that bones were not simple remnants of dead flesh, but containers of spiritual memory. According to this view, when a wise man or saint died, part of their knowledge was not lost with their last breath, but was fixed in their bone structure as an invisible residue, a mineral echo. Their task then was not devotion, but extraction, the study of that resonance the soul left behind, like an energetic signature trapped in calcium. The methods used by the order were never openly documented, but some fragments point to resonance rituals, where bones were placed in metallic structures, similar to xylophones or sounding bowls, that vibrated at a frequency capable of releasing symbols, words, or images into the initiate's mind. Those who witnessed these rites and lived to tell about them spoke of intense visions, collective dreams, of a language that did not come from the ear, but from inside the skull. A Spanish monk, who infiltrated one of these meetings in disguise, wrote before dying that the bone of a prophet was more eloquent than any gospel. The Church never officially recognized the existence of this order, Although in several Inquisition documents there are records of condemnations against individuals accused of post-mortem manipulation or seeking the divine in the inert. The vast majority of these condemnations lack trial or confession, suggesting that the accused were not captured alive, or that their silence was absolute. Some believe that many of these inquisitors knew exactly who they were dealing with, but preferred to erase the evidence rather than try to understand it. Others claim that some clerics secretly collaborated with the order, offering access to crypts and reliquaries in exchange for fragments of knowledge. One of the strangest episodes occurred in 1311 in the city of Perpignan. During the renovation of an ancient chapel, a hidden room was found beneath the altar, where more than 40 skulls were arranged in a circle, with symbols engraved on their foreheads and jaws. Each skull was accompanied by a small wax tablet, written in an unrecognizable language. There were no crosses nor sacred images, only an overwhelming silence. The bishop who authorized the excavation was found dead days later, with his mouth full of bone dust, as if someone had forced him to swallow it. The place was sealed with stone and earth and was never mentioned publicly again. Despite its secrecy, the Order of the Forgotten Bones left its mark on art and architecture. Some capitals of remote churches show figures of hooded men carrying skeletons with reverence, while other sculptures depict bowls filled with bones, surrounded by fire or astral symbols. Even in certain modern museum displays, there are relics without provenance, carved with shapes that do not correspond to Christian iconography, and that, according to experts, date between the 12th and 15th centuries, with no clear link to any recognized culture. Scattered fragments of a practice that tried to be erased, and yet persists as a muted vibration beneath history. The most unsettling thing is that some claim this order never completely disappeared. That, after centuries of persecution and silence, it simply mutated, adapted, hiding under other forms, other names. Some modern theorists believe that certain esoteric groups of the 19th century, especially those linked to mystical phrenology or studies of bone resonance, inherited practices that come directly from this order. Others assert that part of this knowledge was absorbed by hidden branches of Freemasonry, although the Freemasons have never acknowledged it. There is something deeply disturbing about the idea that knowledge does not die with the body, but remains trapped in its remains, waiting to be heard. Something that questions our relationship with death, with the soul, with memory. The Order of the Forgotten Bones seems to have understood this better than anyone, and its existence, though buried by time, continues to remind us that there are secrets hidden not in books or symbols, but in ourselves, in the silent architecture of the skeleton. Because in the end, what is a bone if not a petrified story? A word that no one has translated yet? Perhaps that was the mission of this order, to read with the hands what the eyes cannot see. To extract from the silence of bones the secret music of what we were, what we still are, and what perhaps we should never have discovered, the miracle of the ice mirrors. In the Scandinavian monasteries of the 13th century, where winter was not just a season but a kind of silence that clung to the skin like an unanswered prayer, a strange rumor began to circulate among the monks. It traveled faster than the wind through the frozen fir trees, and took shape within the pages of the record books, in the marginal notes of the Psalms, and in the restless dreams of the novices. They spoke of apparitions without a corporeal form that did not walk or breathe, but manifested themselves inside the ice, not as hazy visions or vaguely human shapes on foggy glass, but as perfect, sharp figures, as if engraved with intention. This phenomenon came to be known, with a mixture of fear and amazement, as the miracle of the ice mirrors. The first documented case dates back to the winter of 1227 in a convent near the Sogne Fjord in Norway. An elderly monk named Albrecht recorded in his diary an event that marked him until the end of his days. According to his writing, during an especially cold dawn, he went out to the cloister intending to fetch water from the well, but was paralyzed when he saw that the inside of the basin, completely frozen for days, reflected his face accompanied by a figure that was not behind him. It was a woman, wrapped in a dark veil, with closed eyes and hands crossed over her chest, as if in eternal rest. Albrecht described her appearance precisely, but what disturbed him the most was recognizing the face. It was his mother, who had died more than 30 years earlier. He tried to show the image to other brothers, but by the time he returned with them, the ice contained nothing. It had returned to its opaque and cloudy state. However, Albrecht swore until his death that what he had seen was neither a hallucination nor a projected memory. It was something there, trapped in the ice, as if the water itself had preserved a memory that only the cold knew how to release. From that episode, other testimonies began to emerge. Monks who saw familiar faces or angelic figures at the bottom of frozen blocks, sometimes inside abandoned chalices, other times in ponds that became mirrors during the coldest nights of the year. The visions were not always peaceful. Some saw scenes of suffering, faces contorted by pain, or eyeless figures that seemed to watch them from inside a frost prison. The most disturbing thing was that these visions did not appear randomly. They always occurred during moments of extreme withdrawal, prolonged fasting, intense prayer, as if the phenomenon responded to a specific mental state of the observer. The phenomenon was briefly studied by a group of clerics sent from Uppsala, who analyzed the sites where the apparitions recurred most frequently. After several days of observation and cryptic notes, they decided to close one of the chapels in the Voss convent without offering any explanation. Official documents disappeared over the years, but an anonymous copy of the report, preserved by a rebellious scribe, describes the appearance of a male figure, naked, with wings made of withered leaves, extending his arms inside the ice, as if begging to get out. From then on, it was decreed that any manifestation inside the ice should be considered proof of supernatural intervention, and speaking of the subject outside the monastery walls was forbidden. In the winter of 1281, a particular case drew the attention of several nobles in the region. A young servant girl from the Nidaros Monastery was found in a trance in front of a frozen pond. She had been standing there all night, without a coat, motionless, staring intently at the ice. When the monks revived her, she only repeated one phrase. "It spoke to me with my own voice." She never regained speech but wrote for weeks on pieces of parchment. What, according to her, had been a conversation with a luminous figure reflected in the ice as if it were an intelligent mirror. One that not only returned her image but also her oldest thoughts, the ones she had forgotten, the ones she did not even know were there. Some interpreted this as a divine manifestation, others as a crack in the mind opened by an even older phenomenon. The so-called ice mirrors began to be treated with a mixture of respect and caution. Some monks wrapped them in blessed cloths and buried them far from the crypts. Others built small stone structures around them, as if trying to contain their influence. The stories grew and mixed with popular superstitions. In certain villages, it was said that during the coldest nights of the year, the ice could trap not only reflections, but souls leaving the body during sleep. It was told that if one saw their own face in the ice but with closed eyes, it meant they would die before the winter ended. Despite efforts to suppress or control the phenomenon, some tried to study it from a less spiritual and more empirical viewpoint. One of them was a monk of German origin named Theodor von Greifswald, who in his letters, now kept in the monastery of Lübeck, proposed the idea that water had a form of visual memory, activated when freezing under certain mental conditions. Although ahead of his time, Theodor was expelled for his ideas, considered heretical, and his work was forgotten. However, his theories bear an eerie resemblance to some modern experiments about the structure of water and its possible sensitivity to emotional or spiritual stimuli. The miracle of the ice mirrors diminished over the centuries, or at least ceased to be mentioned in records. Some attribute this to the progressive warming of the climate in certain northern areas. Others believe it was the church itself that buried the matter, convinced that what manifested in the ice could not come from above, and that speaking about it only fueled dangerous curiosity. Be that as it may, there are still those who claim that in the harshest winters, when the temperature drops low enough and the world seems to stop under a white layer of silence, if one stares fixedly at a frozen surface, it is possible to see more than their reflection. Perhaps the ice mirrors were never miracles in the strict sense of the term, nor visions sent by a higher will. But what they caused was real. It was real for those who saw them, for those who felt deep inside the disturbance of looking at something they should not have seen. Because looking at the ice was, in a way, looking at frozen time, at echoes of what once was, or perhaps at fragments of an alternate present trapped in another dimension of reality. Maybe those mirrors still exist, not as portals or prophecies, but as living traces that there is something in the deep cold, in absolute stillness, that returns a part of ourselves we did not know we had lost. And it only takes a frozen night, a perfect surface, and the courage to look beyond the reflection for the miracle to happen again. The Monastery of the Sealed Doors. On a hill wrapped in the perpetual mist of the Asturian mountains, there stands a stone building that has managed to survive centuries of storms, wars, fires, and neglect. It rises with a solemnity that intimidates, as if its very presence reminded visitors that there are places where time decided to stop, not out of whim, but out of necessity. That place is known among the oldest inhabitants of the region as the Monastery of the Sealed Doors, a name that sounds more like a warning than a mere description. Because this monastery, although still standing and with a facade that seems to defy the passage of centuries, has not been inhabited for over 500 years. And yet, according to some, there is still movement inside. The origins of the monastery date back to the 12th century, although official documents constantly contradict each other about its true founding date. Some codices place it as an expansion of an earlier hermitage dedicated to Saint Gaudentius, while others attribute it to a minor order that mysteriously disappeared after the building was founded. The fact is that it was built with uncommon architecture for the area: narrow corridors, low ceilings, asymmetrical angles, and an interior layout so labyrinthine that even the 16th century blueprints, when it was still operational, are practically impossible to follow without getting lost. More than a place for prayer or retreat, it seemed like a space designed to confuse, to hold, to hide. What makes this monastery special, and what has caused a mixture of fascination and rejection for generations, is that its inner doors have been completely sealed for centuries. Literally. We are not talking about locks or chains, but wooden doors reinforced with thick iron that were covered with layers of stone, mortar, and in some cases, molten lead. The inscriptions that accompany each of these seals do not follow common Christian iconography. Instead of crosses, there are geometric marks, spirals, serrated lines, and symbols that have not been linked to any ancient alphabet. Some researchers have compared them to patterns found on tablets from pre-Indo-European cultures, but with no conclusive results. The closure of the monastery was ordered by the bishopric of Oviedo itself in the mid-15th century, under circumstances that were never publicly detailed. In the closure document, which is still preserved in the ecclesiastical archives, there is only one phrase in Latin: clausa quia loquitur, sealed because it speaks. Since then, no one has lived there again, and those who have tried to study, explore, or restore it have encountered obstacles, both physical and, according to some, of another kind. One of the first attempts to reopen the monastery occurred in 1622, when an enlightened nobleman, Count Ramiro de Mela, financed an archaeological expedition at the site, convinced that the seals hid secret documents or relics of incalculable value. What happened during that expedition was never fully detailed, but it is known that the work stopped abruptly and that several workers fled without being paid. A single field notebook, written by a friar accompanying the expedition, survived the abandonment. In it, he describes how, upon demolishing part of the wall blocking the south cloister door, a dense air emerged that caused 2 men to faint. The friar, who remained conscious, wrote that inside the room voices were heard, not people speaking to each other, but a single voice that spoke as if reading without stopping. No one found the source of the sound. The next day, the place was closed again. For centuries, nearby villagers avoided passing close to the monastery, especially after nightfall. They said that the bells, although rusted and eaten away by time, rang on their own some days of the year, especially during the winter solstice and the night of St. John. They also spoke of interior lights, shadows walking by the sealed windows, and a presence that could be felt when approaching too closely. A tense stillness, as if the air itself warned that a boundary was being crossed that should not be touched. In 1884, a group of French spiritualists, fascinated by the rumors of the place, arrived at the monastery intending to record supernatural phenomena. They stayed there for 3 days. The only thing they left was a notebook full of senseless notes and drawings of faceless human figures. They never returned to France. Their bodies were found weeks later in a cabin several kilometers away, wrapped in blankets, in shock, without physical injuries, but completely disconnected from reality. One of them died without regaining speech. The other 2 were institutionalized for the rest of their lives in a psychiatric hospital in Bordeaux. In recent times, the scientific community has tried to explain the monastery's phenomena with logical arguments. Accumulation of underground gases, architecture generating unusual echoes, collective suggestion, or even mental illnesses caused by isolation. However, none of these theories explains why the Vatican keeps the place under discreet surveillance. A letter signed by an apostolic nuncio in 1942 recommends no intervention or excavation at the site and suggests that any restoration attempt be symbolic, without touching the sealed doors. The text ends with a curious warning. There are things that were closed intentionally, not to keep them from leaving, but to keep them from coming back in. Some more extreme voices claim that the monastery was built over an energy vortex, or a wound in reality, and that the monks who lived there were not fully aware of what lay behind their walls until it was too late. According to these theories, the doors were not sealed to contain something tangible, but to prevent the permeability of something invisible, ancient, that whispered from the other side. Today, the monastery of the sealed doors remains in ruins, its entrances propped up by time and lichens. However, those who have approached it, few and discreet, say that something is felt when touching the stones, a very slight tremor, as if the building were breathing beneath the surface, as if those doors covered by layers of centuries still guarded something that has never completely left. Because there are structures that refuse to die, not because of what they contain, but because of what passes through them. And there are doors that, no matter how tightly sealed with stone and lead, remain what they are. Doors, possibilities, thresholds, warnings, and the monastery of the sealed doors is still there, waiting for the next curious person who believes the walls only hold silence, waiting for the next one who wants to hear what was locked away, not to protect men, but to protect the world, the eyes of God in the Holy Land. During the Crusades, that open wound between 2 worlds that bled for centuries over the burning sands of the East, things happened that no chronicler dared to tell openly. Things that did not fit into the rhetoric of religious fervor, nor into the speeches of conquest. Things that did not respond to steel or dogma. Among those stories, many whispered by soldiers returning with lost gazes, or by clerics who burned their journals after writing them, stands out one that still sends chills through the few archives where it appears. It is the phenomenon that some called the eyes of God in the Holy Land, and despite its name, it brought no comfort nor revelation, but a deep discomfort, as if someone had briefly pulled aside the veil of the human to show everyone something they should not see. The first mentions of this event come from the First Crusade, during the siege of Antioch in the year 1098. In a letter written by a Norman knight, recovered decades later in a monastery in Rouen, an episode is recounted that occurred during a moonless night when the sentries of the Christian camp observed in the sky two spheres of light suspended, fixed like open eyes, watching us from an impossible height. The night describes in detail how the temperature suddenly dropped, the wind stopped, and the constant murmur of prayers and supplications turned into a forced silence, as if the very air had been withdrawn from the field. The most disturbing part, according to the testimony, was not the sighting itself, but the reaction of the men. Several fell to their knees, not in worship, but in an inexplicable trance, and began to speak in unknown tongues, some with voices that did not seem their own. Days later, half of that squadron was found dead, with no signs of violence, their eyes open and pupils dilated, as if they had seen something too vast to process. The rest were removed from the front and sent back to Europe, although most never arrived. Their names disappeared from official records, and some bishops began to refer to them as the touched by the gaze, as if what they had witnessed had adhered to their souls irreversibly. Throughout the subsequent campaigns, these spheres of light appeared again, almost always just before decisive battles or during unusual periods of truce. Some crusaders began to fear those suspended eyes more than enemy swords. In the Third Crusade, during the advance toward Jerusalem, the personal chronicler of an English count recorded a similar sighting over the hills of Bethlehem. This time, the lights moved slowly, crossing the sky in complete silence, casting no shadow but causing a physical reaction in those who looked at them too long. Nosebleeds, tremors, loss of balance, and in some cases, temporary memory loss. The phenomenon was considered a divine omen by some, while others began speaking privately of a surveillance that did not come from the heaven described in Scripture. A manuscript attributed to a retired Templar, kept in the secret archives of Toledo, narrates a closer encounter that occurred in an improvised chapel outside Acre. According to this account, the monks were celebrating a night mass when a light descended slowly, completely enveloping the structure. The chants ceased. One of the friars tried to approach the doorway but fell to the ground with his skin covered in an inexplicable frost. The Templar's testimony details that the light neither burned nor dazzled. It had no heat, but it was not cold either. It was aware, as if whatever manifested there knew exactly who it was watching. And the most unsettling, inside that light, for a brief instant, everyone saw their own faces reflected, but older, more tired, as if they had aged years in seconds. Attempts to officially record these events were systematically suppressed. Any attempt to describe them as miracles was rejected by the most conservative theologians, who could not fit such occurrences within doctrine. They were not appearances of saints, nor Marian manifestations, nor prophetic signs in the traditional sense. They were something else, something uncomfortable, something that obeyed neither the logic of faith nor that of reason. For this reason, many of the manuscripts that survived did so thanks to the stubbornness of anonymous scribes who hid fragments in margins, among psalms, or in the first pages of prayer books. In one of these fragments, there is mention of a possible connection between these lights and ancient pre-Christian tales of the region. Some Orthodox priests spoke of the silent guardians, entities described in Syriac texts as watchers who manifested from formless heights, especially when human actions began to disturb the balance of the world. They did not punish, did not speak, did not intervene. They only watched. But their presence was enough to break wills, to transform the perception of those who saw them. The most puzzling was the pattern some began to notice toward the end of the Crusades. The eyes of light seemed to manifest more frequently when atrocities were committed, when armies, from both sides, desecrated temples, pillaged villages, or murdered civilians. It was as if the lights descended to judge, not as emissaries of any faith, but as uncomfortable witnesses, and those who saw them or survived their presence were never the same again. Over time, these accounts disappeared from official documents. The Church preferred to silence these testimonies to avoid diverting focus from its holy narrative. But in certain orders, especially among the Carthusians and the oldest Benedictines, the memory of the phenomenon is still preserved. A Carthusian codex found in Dijon contains a disturbing drawing: two spheres suspended over a deserted plain, from which lines descend that do not touch the ground, but cause it to tremble. In the margin, a single phrase: "They were not stars, they were awake." In more recent times, some archaeologists and explorers have claimed to experience strange phenomena at certain ruins in the Holy Land, especially in places known for sightings of this kind. Recording equipment failing, compasses spinning uncontrollably, and a persistent feeling of being watched from a point that cannot be located. Official reports attribute it to magnetic faults, heat, fatigue. But there are those who still whisper another name for what manifested among the sands. The eyes of something that was there before the Crusades, before religions, even before words. The eyes of God in the Holy Land are not a miracle nor a collective hallucination. They are, according to the most persistent accounts, the judgment-free gaze of a presence watching from above, not to punish, but to remind that every action leaves a mark. That history, even in its most glorious or bloodiest moments, is not written only in earth and blood, but also under the watch of something that does not need to intervene to make its power felt. Something that remains there, waiting and watching, always watching: the Infinite Hourglass. Among the dusty showcases of medieval knowledge, among the alchemical treatises that promised to transmute the soul and the grimoires that spoke of angels hidden in geometry, appears in almost furtive fragments the mention of an object as unusual as it is puzzling: the Infinite Hourglass. There are no clear illustrations, nor diagrams that represent it precisely, only descriptions that seem more the product of obsession than direct observation. And yet, they all agree on the essential: a device that defied natural laws, a clock that never stopped, that never emptied, whose sands did not flow to the bottom but seemed to oscillate, as if there were no up or down, only an eternal cycle trapped inside it. The origin of this object is uncertain. Some traces place it in the Holy Roman Empire during the second half of the 14th century, more precisely at the court of Landgrave Ernst von Thüringen, an eccentric nobleman known for his collection of impossible objects: knives that did not cut living matter, books without visible writing, and, according to a letter signed by his own scribe, an hourglass that does not measure the time of the world, but the time of the soul. The letter, dated 1371, describes how the artifact arrived in an oak box sealed with Hebrew symbols, carried by a man whom no one saw arrive or leave, and who was received without words by the Landgrave himself. The object was installed in a windowless room, on a marble base carved with Latin phrases that no one fully managed to translate. Servants were forbidden to enter that room, and for years it was said that only the Landgrave had access to it. However, rumors began to spread quickly. There were nights when the door of the room glowed with a bluish light, and those who passed nearby claimed to hear a soft, hypnotic humming, similar to the song of a distant flute. Some claimed that time distorted near the place. One guard swore that his 2-hour shift seemed to last only a few minutes. Another, on the other hand, felt that 3 days had passed although the sun had barely begun to set. When the Landgrave died, his servants discovered that the room with the clock was empty. The marble base remained there, but the object had disappeared without a trace. Only an incomplete manuscript was found, written in a nervous hand, in which Ernst von Thüringen confessed that he had contemplated his own end a dozen times. "The clock does not show how time ends," he wrote, "but how many times a death can be repeated before it stops hurting." No one fully understood what he meant. From that moment on, references to the Infinite Hourglass began to scatter throughout Europe. They appear in chronicles of Italian alchemists, in diaries of Eastern travelers, and even in apocryphal sermons by certain hermits who preached about the existence of a tool created not by God nor by men, but by something earlier, something that understood time not as a line, but as a spiral. In all the accounts, the clock is never described exactly the same. Some see it suspended in the air. Others imagine it as a glass urn with thick liquid that turns into sand upon touching the bottom. The only constant is its effect on those who observe it, an alteration in the perception of time, a disconnection from the present, an existential vertigo that many cannot endure. In 1431, a German monk named Otto von Hellsen wrote a brief treatise titled De Temporis Fragmentis, where he details his encounter with the clock in a Cistercian monastery in the Alps. According to his account, the object was found in a bricked-up cell in the West Wing, discovered by accident during renovations. The room was empty except for the clock floating a few centimeters above the ground, without visible support, oscillating as if it were breathing. Otto writes that as he approached, he heard his own voice speaking to him from inside the artifact. It was not an echo, nor a thought. It was his voice, but aged, desperate, begging him to stay away. The monk never entered that cell again. Days later, the clock disappeared. Only a circle marked on the floor remained, and a handful of black sand that no one dared to touch. The few alchemists who have written about it agree that the clock does not measure the passage of common time, but an internal form of duration, a kind of measure of the life cycle of consciousness. According to one of these texts, attributed to Paracelsus, although its authenticity is debated, the clock contained the salt of the soul, a volatile component that reacted to the proximity of human thoughts, showing fragments of probable futures or memories of unlived lives. In other words, the clock did not predict the future nor reveal the past. It showed interrupted paths, moments that could have been but were not, decisions one did not make, and that nevertheless persisted as echoes in the body. Throughout the 16th century, several attempts were made to replicate the artifact. Watchmakers, astronomers, and natural philosophers tried to build similar devices, combining sands of different densities, crystals cut with mathematical precision, and hidden mechanisms that imitated the inverse flow of time. None came close to the original phenomenon. What they produced were curious imitations, beautiful objects but empty. The true clock, the one that seemed to contain something more than matter, always disappeared after being seen. Some believe it manifests only to those who need it, or to those on the edge of some irreversible transformation. In recent centuries, there have been those who claim to have seen it. An 18th century Swiss explorer claimed to have found it in a cave under the Pyrenees, held by roots growing upside down. A Napoleonic soldier said he saw it in Egypt, in the ruins of a temple submerged by sand. There is even a secret World War II report mentioning an artifact capable of altering subjective time perception in a controlled manner, briefly recovered by a special unit in the mountains of Croatia. There is no proof, only stories and a constant feeling that the clock, one way or another, keeps turning somewhere, feeding on questions no one knows how to ask. The Infinite Hourglass is not a time machine. It is something much more subtle. It is a mirror where time sees itself without recognizing itself, a witness to all possible bifurcations of a life, a bright wound in the flow of days, where the present mixes with what could have been, and the sand does not fall. It floats, dances, remembers. And in that memory, those who have seen it are marked forever. Because there are clocks that mark the hours, and there are clocks that mark what the hours forgot. The infinite hourglass belongs to the latter, to those that do not fit in calendars, to those that keep beating when everything seems to have stopped. And perhaps, if you ever find it, you will not know by seeing it, but by feeling that something inside you has begun to run backwards, the witches of the black honey. There are stories that ferment over time, like a wine too thick that has been kept in the shadow of the world. Stories that do not appear in official books, nor in the witchcraft treatises that the Inquisition piled up to be burned in public squares. Stories that survive in the wrinkled mouths of shepherds, in the songs of old midwives, and in the whispers of the mist-covered hills. Among these stories, one has endured through the centuries with the persistence of something never fully understood. the legend of the witches of the black honey, women who did not worship the devil, nor made pacts at crossroads, but wove their power from the beehives in a damp and hidden corner of Transylvania, where the bees did not fear the darkness. The first rumors arose in villages at the foot of the Carpathians, on the vague border between the Kingdom of Hungary and the territories of the Ottoman Empire. They were not direct accusations, nor inquisitorial trials like those in Germany or France. What was said was much stranger. There were women, they said, who did not need mandrake potions or invocation circles. Their power was in the honeycombs, in a honey that was not golden, but black as tar, thick like blood that had been spilled underground. A honey that appeared only once a year, during the new moon of October, and which, according to the few who tasted it and lived to tell the tale, had a flavor impossible to describe, something between sweet, metallic, and sacred. According to local tradition, these women, never more than 7 at a time, lived apart, at the edge of the forests, in houses that did not age, covered with vines that bloomed even in winter. It was said they did not age either, that generations passed and their faces remained the same, although their names changed. None had husbands. They were not known to have children. But the villagers, although they looked at them with fear, did not completely avoid them. In fact, they came to them in secret, to cure illnesses that priests did not know how to name, to ease difficult births, to ask for dreams that answered impossible questions, and always, as payment, they had to bring something that had fermented, a spoiled fruit, a piece of moldy bread, a tear kept in a handkerchief. The central component of their rites was the black honey, known in the local language as negrumier, whose preparation was never fully understood. It was said that the bees producing it were not ordinary. They were smaller, dark in color, with wings that shone at dusk as if containing tiny sparks. They did not swarm on trees or cliffs, but inside deep caves where light never reached. The witches descended alone, covered with veils and seam-free robes, and returned hours later with sealed jars of carved wood, which were not opened until the circle was complete. It is believed that the black honey had properties beyond medicine or poison. Upon ingesting it, some claimed to enter a state of consciousness where they could speak with the dead, or at least with their memories. Others said they did not speak to anyone but saw scenes of their own life from the outside, as if seated in a chair that allowed them to observe every decision made, every word spoken, like a slow and painful movie. The effects were unpredictable. Some vomited for hours. Others fell into a deep sleep from which they awoke days later, different, changed, as if something had been torn out or replaced inside them. On one occasion, according to a letter from a salt merchant who passed through the region in 1528, a young noblewoman of Viennese origin, fleeing her home for reasons never clarified, arrived in one of these villages and asked to be received by the women of the honey. She was led to one of their houses and was never seen again. Weeks later, a woman identical to her was seen selling honey at the market, but she did not speak, did not respond to her name, and had completely black eyes without irises. No one stopped her. No one openly recognized her. They simply let her leave when the sun set. The church never acted officially against these women. There are no trials, no autos da fe, no known processes. But in certain private letters from bishops and itinerant exorcists, there is cautious mention of the presence of a cult without an altar, whose prayers are the buzzing of insects and whose processions crawl underground. In a letter preserved in the Vatican archives, a papal envoy writes that the region of the dark apiaries is not mission land, because what happens there does not respond to heresy, but to something that precedes it. No further envoys were sent. Some have tried to link this tradition with ancient pre-Christian cults, connected to the goddess Artemis or even older deities related to the earth and death. Some archaeologists have found idols buried in caves in the area, female figures carved in black stone, with swollen bellies and outstretched hands, covered with what seems to be hardened wax. The dating of these objects defies known chronology. They are older than Slavic settlements, older than the Dacians, even older than agriculture. There is no clear explanation. Today, the witches of the black honey seem to have vanished over the centuries. No one admits to having seen them. No one says they exist. But beekeepers in the mountains, in the most remote regions of Romania, still recount certain unwritten rules. Never approach the hives that are too hidden. Never harvest the honey if the bees remain silent. Never sell the first harvest of the year if it has a darker tone than usual. They say there are jars that must be buried if not opened at first. And from time to time, a woman without a name arrives in the village to ask for wax. But she does not speak. She only leaves old coins and leaves before dawn. The witches of the black honey did not burn books. They did not weave curses in bubbling cauldrons. Their magic was subtler, older, more vegetal. It was the result of communion with forces that did not respond to the duality of good or evil, but to a wisdom that sprouted from the damp earth, from the cracks of the forest, from the perfect symmetry of a beehive. Perhaps that is why they survived so long, because their power was not in scandal, but in the whisper, in what ferments, in what matures in the shadow. And perhaps there are still hives waiting deep inside some cave, invisible beehives that only buzz when no one is listening, producing that honey as dense as the night. Maybe the power those women awakened did not extinguish, but continues flowing in silence, in the mouths of those who keep ancient secrets, in rituals that no one now recognizes as such. Because honey, in the end, always holds something of the place where it was created. And there are places where darkness blooms, the kingdom of the inverted. There are stories that do not seem to speak of a place, but rather of a reflection. Tales that arise as if they were distorted echoes of a world existing beneath our feet, or behind the veil of the visible, where rules lose their meaning and the familiar turns into a threat. Within the fragmented body of the Middle Ages, where myths blended with reality through repetition in monasteries, camps, and markets, few stories proved as unsettling as that of the kingdom of the inverted, a place that, according to the oldest accounts, was not reached by walking, but by stumbling with the mind. The oldest references appear in marginal manuscripts, almost always written in red ink or hurried calligraphy, as if the scribe were in a rush to finish what should not have been written. One of the most cited is the Codex Aversus, partly preserved in the library of Palermo, where an anonymous monk describes his encounter with a place of total investiture, where everything the world knows is present, but reversed. Not only objects and paths, but also ideas, names, and time. What rises, falls. What heals, sickens. What is born, disappears without ever having existed. This kingdom was not accessible through roads, seas, or coordinates. It appeared. It manifested. Sometimes after a long fevered delirium, other times after certain prayers spoken in disorder or as the result of failed rituals. It was said that some people fell into it unknowingly, during sleep or even during waking, and upon returning, if they returned, they brought back a strange silence, as if something inside them had been turned around and they no longer knew which direction their own heart beat. One of the most complete testimonies belongs to a figure as mysterious as forgotten, the cartographer Godefroy de l'Aube, who during his captivity in Constantinople wrote a series of letters addressed to his brother, describing in detail a world where the earth breathes inward and the sky curves downward like a dome of bone. According to Godefroy, he was led to that kingdom after ingesting a mixture of unknown roots in an esoteric ceremony practiced by a local sect, and he awoke in a place that seemed like his native village, but with the river flowing backward, bells ringing without moving, and the dead walking silently toward churches to pray for the living. In his letters, Godefroy details the architecture of the place: buildings without doors, plazas without centers, trees whose roots hung toward the sky while their crowns were buried in the earth. The inhabitants, whom he calls the torsos without shadows, had familiar faces but inverted, as if the eyes were where the lips should be, and whispers emerged from the forehead. They did not speak, but they understood. They did not see, but they knew. And above all, they feared something they never named. A presence dwelling in the depths of the kingdom, beneath the structures, beyond the ground, as if that entire world were built not to protect, but to conceal. Again and again, in the few surviving accounts, the notion of inversion appears as a sacred principle. In the kingdom of the inverted, piety was punishment, wisdom was ignorance, and death was the beginning of life. But a life that did not begin with crying, but with the memory of all that was never lived. Those who entered there did not find monsters, but alternate versions of themselves. Mothers who never became mothers, men who never learned to speak, lovers who never crossed paths. As if that kingdom stored all the failed variants of existence, a catalog of what the world discarded as incoherent, but that still retained a way of being. During the 14th century, several theologians tried to rationalize these stories, accusing their narrators of being victims of the devil or of having ingested forbidden substances. But some, the boldest, began to wonder if that kingdom was, in reality, a kind of reflection of creation, a living shadow of our world. If everything we know had a mirror equivalent, a total inversion that remains active even though most men never perceive it. A fragment found in the archives of the Abbey of Clonmacnoise in Ireland mentions a particularly strange case, that of a young novice who disappeared during the night and was found 5 days later in the monastery cemetery, digging downward with his bare hands. He did not remember his name. He spoke as if all words were reversed. He said pain for hope, inside for outside, and most unsettling of all, he repeatedly insisted that time was badly sown, that what we feel as continuity was only an error of perception, and that underneath all this there is another map, one that bleeds backward. In some occult circles, especially in certain branches of 15th century Germanic esotericism, the kingdom of the inverted was considered a threshold, a liminal space between realities, accessible during moments of extreme soul crisis, profound losses, deliriums, illnesses that brought one to the brink of death. These scholars claimed the kingdom was not a literal place, but a collective mental structure, where the contradictions of humanity accumulated, all that could not be openly expressed in the world of stable forms. The curious thing is that certain alchemical codices refer to a stage of the spiritual process called the descent into the opposite, where the adept must contemplate their distorted reflection to purify the inner matter. And the symbols they use, upside-down crosses, letters read backward, doors opening inward, are eerily similar to the architectural patterns described by Godefroy and other witnesses of the kingdom of the inverted. None of this can be proven, of course. Skeptics will say these are deliriums, myths, medieval inventions to explain mental illness or perception disorders. But there is one detail that persists in all the accounts, even the most diverse. The feeling that once one has seen that other world, for an instant, one can no longer look at their own world the same way. As if something shifts inside the soul, an axis, a compass, and it can no longer orient itself as before. Some claim that the kingdom of the inverted still waits there, lurking behind a badly made decision, on the other side of insomnia, on the reverse of a word that should never have been spoken. And that some, those who are too broken or too lucid, keep falling into it, because it is not reached by seeking. It is reached unwillingly. When the world bends a little, when reality hesitates, and suddenly what was straight leans, what was clear blurs, and one understands, with a very cold fear, that that other world has always been there, lurking, smiling from the other side of the mirror. The Pope from the other side. In the deepest halls of the Vatican, where light barely touches the walls and silence becomes so thick it seems to have a body, there exists a section of the secret archive that is not listed in official inventories, a sealed area behind steel doors where only certain men enter under a perpetual oath of silence. There, among documents that will never see the light, among confessions of martyrs, undated prophecies, and forbidden treaties, there is a brief file, unsigned, written in handwriting so clean it seems artificial. The title is simple, without embellishments or symbols. About the pontiff who is not of this world. The few who have had access to the text know it by a much more unsettling name, the Pope from the other side. The story begins with an impossible date, December 8th, the year 1183, but not in Rome, nor anywhere recognized in Europe. The recorded place is Domus Transversa, which some experts have interpreted as a symbolic expression, a reference to a site not located within the usual physical plane. The testimony was supposedly delivered by a monk of the Cistercian order named Eberhard, who disappeared months after writing his account and whose existence can only be confirmed through this document. In it, the monk narrates how, during a long pilgrimage to the Holy Land, he was separated from his group by a storm and ended up taking refuge in a cave whose entrance he did not recall seeing before. Inside, he found a sanctuary, not pagan nor Christian, but something in between, as if all religions had tried to leave a part of themselves there. Figures carved into the rock resembling saints, but whose faces were erased. Symbols engraved combining crosses, eyes, wheels, and snakes. And in the center, a figure seated on a black stone throne, dressed in a white cassock. A man with a serene face, old but not elderly, with eyes that, according to the monk's words, seemed to know exactly what one was thinking before having thought it. The dialogue between Eberhard and this being occupies the rest of the testimony. The monk asked who he was, and the man replied in a calm voice, "I am the pontiff of what never came to be." He did not use the name of God, nor mention Christ, nor identify himself as a messenger. He only said he existed among the folds of the world, in a place where decisions not taken, paths not chosen, and unborn souls still had a kind of continuity, an echo. He was, in his words, the Pope of the discarded versions of history. He did not govern a church, but a reflection of it. He did not give blessings, but warnings. He did not write encyclicals, but epitaphs. He assured that his role was not to guide the living, but to observe those who almost lived, those avoided by a tiny choice, a word left unspoken, a door not crossed. For Eberhard, this was blasphemy. He thought he was facing a disguised demon, but the man did not get angry. He only showed him a book. One that, according to the monk, was made of pages of smoke that changed with every glance. On those pages, Eberhard saw moments he did not recognize as his own, but knew belonged to him. A life where he had been an abbot, another where he had died as a child, one more where he had never existed. The story ends with a phrase that Eberhard carved into the stone at the cave entrance before returning, which was found centuries later by an Ottoman explorer. "The chair on the other side is occupied. Do not pray for it to rise." The document was taken to the Vatican in 1617, after having passed through the hands of multiple collectors. A Jesuit priest translated it from the original Latin and presented it as evidence of possible heretical delirium. But instead of being destroyed, it was classified as content of elevated esoteric interest and kept under the custody of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Since then, it has been reviewed by only a dozen cardinals, all of whom recorded having felt a temperature change in the room upon reading it. Over the centuries, new references began to emerge, fragmentary in form. In a letter signed by an 18th century Florentine cardinal, there is mention of the appearance of a man dressed as the Pope. but who did not speak, watching from the top of a ruined cathedral during an eclipse. In a marginal note by a Polish mystic, there is talk of a white figure seated on a stone throne, reading the books of decisions never made. Even in the records of the Second Vatican Council, in unpublished documents, there is a note about a collective dream experienced by 3 bishops during a night session. All 3 saw a white figure sitting with his back turned in a church without crosses, whispering psalms backwards. Those who believe in his existence say that the Pope from the other side is a living symbol of balance. That as long as there is someone to watch what was not, the world that is can hold itself up without collapsing. Others claim he is an interdimensional entity, a presence that takes the form of a pontiff to convey comprehensible authority, but whose true purpose is much darker: to record history's omissions, to feed on what time rejects, and to sustain, by his mere presence, the gap between the real and the possible. The Vatican has never directly denied the existence of the document, but neither has it confirmed it. The archivists working in the deepest levels of the archive acknowledge that there are files not meant to be understood, but simply preserved. As if the truth they contain were so dense, so impossible, that just remaining silent before it was already a form of liturgy. The Pope from the other side is not a figure of power, nor an open threat. He is, rather, a presence that reminds that every choice opens one world and closes another. That every time someone prays, there is an echo that responds from the other side, not as affirmation, but as truncated possibility. And that perhaps deep down, he does not govern a kingdom of shadows, but of alternatives, where dogma holds no weight, because what matters is not what is believed, but what was avoided believing. And if he still exists today, sitting on his stone throne, reading the invisible pages of time, he does so without expecting anyone to seek him out, because he is not there to be found. He is there to keep watching, to make sure that what never was remains so. The Blood Orb of the Danube. Among the cold waters of the Danube, where the river ceases to be just a watercourse and becomes a border between civilizations, hides a legend that has defied the passage of time with a persistence as silent as it is unsettling. It is not a creature, nor a religious apparition, nor a divine punishment, although all these elements seem to be contained within its core. It is an object, an artifact that, according to the stories still whispered by the oldest fishermen of the region, should not exist. They call it the Blood Orb of the Danube, and they say that once you have seen it, your life divides into a before and an after. It does not appear always. It has no fixed location, nor an exact date to manifest. It emerges, according to testimonies, on certain new moon nights, when the current becomes strangely still, and the air thickens with a humidity that smells more like iron than water. At those moments, floating without moving, without being carried by the flow, appears a sphere of dark red color, the size of a human head, so smooth that it does not reflect light, so perfect that it seems unreal. Some claim it is made of glass. Others say its surface is organic, like hardened skin. The only thing everyone agrees on is that it beats, as if it had its own pulse, a life enclosed inside. The first written mention of the orb appears in a 13th century Hungarian codex, kept in the library of the Pannonhalma Monastery. On one of its pages, a monk notes, almost as a marginal comment, that the orb of the river has appeared again, and the children of the village have not woken since last night. The phrase, stripped of context, was ignored by scholars for centuries. But over time, other mentions began to surface, separated by decades and sometimes by more than 100 kilometers, all recounting the same thing: a red sphere, suspended above the water, always accompanied by an inexplicable event: a disappearance, a sudden illness, a change in personality, a silence too long in a house that used to be full of voices. During the 14th century, in times of invasions and plague, sightings became more frequent. There are records of Serbian soldiers who refused to cross the river after seeing the orb floating near the shore. They claim to have heard in the absolute silence a kind of song emitted by the sphere, a deep, almost imperceptible sound that did not come from outside, but from inside their own heads. One of them tore off his ears. Another fell to his knees crying and saying he had seen the face of his dead mother inside the orb. When they tried to shoot arrows at it, the projectiles neither pierced nor bounced. They simply disappeared upon touching its surface. An especially disturbing account comes from a vanished village, whose ruins can still be visited near the current border between Hungary and Romania. The record was written by a nobleman investigating the total loss of communication with the place. Upon arrival, he found intact houses, fresh food on the tables, candles still lit, but not a single human being. The animals remained there, restless, tense. In the center of the village square, floating above the well, was the orb. The nobleman describes it as an overwhelming presence, as if the air trembled around it. He assures that while looking at it, he remembered things he had never lived, moments from a life that was not his, names he did not recognize, but which filled him with a nostalgia so intense that he almost threw himself into the well. His squire stopped him. Both fled that same night. Upon returning with more men the next day, the orb had disappeared, and with it, any trace of the strange phenomenon. During the following centuries, the blood orb of the Danube became part of local folklore. Some communities began placing protective symbols near the docks. Others stopped fishing in certain parts of the river for fear of attracting it. It was said that whoever tried to touch it fell ill, that those who stared at it too long began to hear voices, that if someone disappeared near the water, it was because they had been seen by the orb. It became a taboo, one of those topics whispered quietly under the breath, so the river would not hear. But beyond fear, theories also arose. Some 18th century esoteric scholars claimed that the orb was not a physical object, but a form of pure consciousness, a kind of witness that traveled the world collecting fragments of history, memories, traumas. According to this view, the orb would be a tool of judgment or collection, a receptacle of the most intense emotions, a kind of living archive fed by suffering. Others, more pragmatic, tried to explain it as an optical phenomenon, an illusion caused by gases in the water, by unknown minerals, or even by some form of animal bioluminescence not yet catalogued. But no theory withstood direct experience, because the orb does not behave like something from this world. And those who have seen it know that what floats over the Danube is not an illusion. In more recent times, the orb has been spoken of less, as if modernity had erased from the maps not only the ancient villages, but also the mysteries that accompanied them. But there are still fishermen, forest rangers, smugglers, and travelers who, when stopping by the riverbank on certain moonless nights, have sworn to see it. They do not speak much. They do not insist. They only say that the river changed that night, that something lit up in the water, that they felt watched by something that had no eyes, but that knew exactly who they were. There are even rumors of photographs taken by tourists in the 20th century, but none have been verified. In the most convincing ones, what appears is not a sphere, but a void, a distortion, a dark hole suspended above the surface, as if the image could not process what was really there. The blood orb of the Danube is one of those pieces of the puzzle that do not fit with the rest of the world. A silent presence that does not need to explain its origin to inspire respect. It cannot be caught, studied, or controlled. It is something that simply is, waiting, sliding through the currents, perhaps searching for an emotion intense enough, a memory old enough, a guilt deep enough to be reflected on its surface. And if ever by chance or fate you see it, do not touch it. Do not speak to it. Do not look inside for too long, because the orb is not there to teach you something. It is there to meet you, and afterward, nothing will be the same. Because there are things that the river neither drags, nor forgets, nor buries. There are things the river keeps, things that watch, things that beat. The chronicles of the animals that spoke. At the edges of what is possible, where medieval codices dare to record what church councils preferred to ignore, there exists a collection as unusual as it is fascinating. The Chronicles of the Animals that Spoke. At first glance, it might seem like just another set of allegorical fantasies written by bored monks, a handful of fables wrapped in Christian moralism. But when one carefully examines the dates, the sources, the seals, and the names of the witnesses involved, it begins to become clear that something deeper lies hidden between the lines. We are not talking about symbolic tales nor children's stories. We are talking about records that, under oath and in ecclesiastical Latin, claim that at certain times and places, common animals began to speak with a human voice, and with knowledge that no man should have. The first solid account appears at the Monastery of St. Gall, Switzerland, around the year 1148. In the Liber Miraculorum, a compendium of inexplicable events collected by the monk Theodoricus, the confession of a peasant is detailed, who claimed to have heard his own horse say his name while he was asleep. It was not a neigh distorted by imagination or alcohol, but a clear phrase, in Old German, spoken with the exact tone his mother used when scolding him as a child. The horse never spoke again, but the next day, the man abandoned his field, gave his house to the monastery, and retired into perpetual silence, convinced he had been warned by a being from beyond. What is peculiar about this case is that it was taken seriously by the superiors. The abbot ordered the event to be recorded and compared it with another testimony from a decade earlier in Bavaria, where a hunting dog, returning from a military campaign, had looked intently at its master and said, "What you lost still breathes in the snow." The soldier, who had lost his son in an avalanche a month before, traveled to the indicated place and found the child still alive under a cavity formed by the ice. The dog died that very night. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the chronicles multiplied, always coming from convents, castles, or rural roads far from the bustle of cities. Most share common elements. Animals that speak only once, in a low and serene voice, using words that only make sense to the listener. There are never multiple witnesses. There are never repetitions. It is as if nature opened just for a moment, like a precise crack between the animal and the human, and then closed forever again. One of the strangest accounts appears in the secret archive of the Monte Cassino Abbey. It is a document dated 1205, bearing the seal of Abbot Pietro di Morano, which describes how a raven was captured by the monks for desecrating a statue of the Virgin. According to the records, the animal was locked in a wooden cage and fed blessed bread. 3 days later, in front of 12 brothers, the raven said, "It is not the mother who cries, it is the daughter not yet born." The phrase, without context, sowed chaos. 2 monks died days later of unexplained fevers, and the statue was removed from the temple and buried underground. The manuscript ends with a handwritten note in the margins. The language of beasts does not come from sin, but from origin. Some attributed these phenomena to demonic possessions, interpreting each case as a strategy of evil to confuse or frighten. But this explanation never fully convinced the most meticulous, not because the facts were less disturbing, but because the content of the phrases did not fit the typical pattern of deceit. There was no temptation, no blasphemy, no promises. Only raw truths, fragments of the future, hidden memories, or veiled warnings that touched the listener so precisely that it was impossible to dismiss them as coincidence. In a lost codex, rescued by a Hungarian collector in the 17th century, the case of a wild boar wounded by a noble in the forests of Moravia is narrated. While bleeding, the animal dragged itself to the hunter and said, "You have not been yourself for 3 moons." The man, deeply affected, later confessed that on that date, he had mistakenly killed his own brother during a night hunt and had hidden the crime. His confession was neither forced nor sought. It simply happened, as if the animal's voice had unlocked a truth that needed to come out through guilt. The phenomenon also repeats in more domestic circumstances. A convent cat that utters a single word before dying. Be silent. A goat that refuses to cross a bridge until it says, looking at the shepherd. What you threw into the water waits for you on the other side. There is even a record in the Canterbury archives of a fish that, according to an anonymous friar, spoke within a dream and revealed the location of a forbidden book buried under the cloister. The book was found and destroyed. The fish, if it ever existed, never spoke again. What unites all these cases is the impossibility of explaining them through logic or doctrine. They are events that break normality without noise, like whispers that cut the fabric of the world at just the right moment. Some thinkers, like the French mystic Albin of Chartres, suggested that animals were not speaking by themselves, but were acting as channels of an ancient intelligence, a form of primordial consciousness that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of the living, waiting for an opening, a crack, a vulnerability in the listener. The Council of Lyon in 1274 issued a brief and ambiguous edict on the matter, declaring that all language without soul is echo, and the echo must not guide faith. But even among the most rigid clerics, private accounts, personal writings, and confessions were preserved where the phenomenon kept appearing, like a shameful truth that could not be fully denied. Today, anthropologists who have studied these chronicles dismiss them as rural superstitions, symptoms of mental illness, or metaphors misunderstood over the centuries. But even from the coldness of modern analysis, there is something that escapes categorization. Not because of the extraordinariness of the fact, but because of the accuracy of its effects. Because what those animals said did not change the world. It changed those who heard them. The chronicles of the animals that spoke do not belong to the world of fables, nor to that of miracles. They are cracks in logic, tiny breaches through which, perhaps, something older and wiser reminds us that consciousness is not the exclusive property of humans, that there are other ways of understanding, that sometimes the universe needs to speak and chooses the voice we least expect. And perhaps, just perhaps, that voice still whispers beneath the skin of the world, waiting for the right moment to tell us something we do not want to hear, but that once heard can never be forgotten. The Labyrinth beneath Chartres. Among the towering pillars of the Cathedral of Chartres, where light passes through stained glass as if to bless the dust suspended in the air, there is a silence that is not entirely religious. It is something deeper, older, something that vibrates beneath the chants and seems to belong to another era. Pilgrims, as they walk over the slabs of the labyrinth that adorns the floor of the main nave, step on it unknowingly, without even imagining that what they see is not just a sculpted symbol, but the entrance to a secret that the stone has been guarding for centuries. Because beneath that cathedral, buried under layers of history, something more than foundations sleeps. They call it the Labyrinth beneath Chartres, and it does not appear on any plans. It is not the visible labyrinth, the one everyone knows, that circular path with 11 turns that many traverse on their knees as penance. That is merely the reflection, the upper echo of something happening below, beneath the crypt, where the dampness clings to the skin like a warning. The existence of the underground labyrinth has never been officially confirmed by the Church, nor recognized by those responsible for the monument's conservation. But that has not stopped dozens of researchers, mystics, architects, and even monks from leaving records of their passage through that lower level. Of that other space that does not open with keys or doors, but with symbols and alignments. The first to mention it was a 12th century canon, Jean de Laon, in a letter addressed to his master in Paris. In it, he describes an experience during the construction of the Gothic cathedral, built over the ruins of earlier temples, some of which, according to John himself, were already considered sacred long before the arrival of Christianity. Beneath the foundations lie stones older than any scripture, he wrote. Then he added a more cryptic phrase: down there faith bends over itself, and everything that is straight above, down there turns. The underground labyrinth, according to surviving testimonies, was not carved suddenly. It was discovered. That is, it was there before the cathedral, even before the Marian temple that stood in the same place during the Merovingian period. Some claim its origin is Druidic. Others say it was the work of an even older civilization, vanished without leaving any trace except that set of passages and chambers arranged with such precise geometry that even the Gothic builders dared not alter it. They only surrounded it, they respected it, and over time, they covered it. According to the oldest texts, it was not a labyrinth like the ones we know. There were no walls of bushes or ceilings. It was an underground system, a set of narrow corridors interconnected by hexagonal chambers and stairs that descended in a spiral. The strangest thing was its layout. It had no center. Or rather, everything seemed to be the center, as if each point in the journey was the same point seen from another perspective. It was said that those who entered unprepared became trapped not by the physical architecture, but by a mental phenomenon: the loss of directional sense. A complete confusion of time, space, and memory. One of the most disturbing cases is that of Abbot Guillaume of Bourges, who in the year 1231 descended into the labyrinth accompanied by 2 acolytes and did not return until 3 days later, completely disoriented, mute, and with his nails covered in black dirt. He could not explain what happened. He only repeated for weeks an inverted psalm. His companions were never found. His testimony was erased from church records, but a copy of his confession, written in a now lost manuscript, circulated in clandestine copies for centuries. In it, he spoke of a formless door, of a constant whisper, and of a hooded figure walking toward him without touching the ground. Those few who have tried to map the labyrinth agree that its shape does not follow any conventional architectural model. It is a circuit that replicates cosmic structures, golden proportions, and constellations. Each chamber seems aligned with specific astronomical events. During equinoxes, the light entering from certain upper stained glass windows coincides with invisible points on this hidden path. Some claim that in one of the passages, if one remains in absolute silence, a heartbeat can be heard. Not mechanical, not human. Something deeper, as if the entire place had a heart. There is an esoteric theory that holds the labyrinth beneath Chartres was built, or discovered, to contain something. Not an object nor a body, but an idea. A form of thought that could not circulate freely on the surface, because it was too powerful or too corrosive. According to this view, the place functions as a kind of symbolic prison. The path does not lead to a revelation, but to a sealing, a ritual compression of something that must not be released. And that is why its structure is repetitive, closed, hypnotic, like a spell walked with the feet. In later centuries, numerous Hermetic groups tried to penetrate the labyrinth. The Templars left signs of their passage on the walls of the crypts. The Rosicrucians spoke of the black heart of the stone, referring to a central chamber where soul inversion rituals supposedly took place, a sort of inner mirror where men saw not what they were, but what they were destined to avoid being. During the French Revolution, many passages were destroyed or sealed forever. Others were rediscovered during 19th century restorations, but were closed again without explanation. The only things preserved from those explorations are cryptic diaries, drawings repeating spiral patterns, and the constant expression of those who descended. Nothing down there remains still. Today, access to the lower levels is strictly restricted. Guided tours do not include any mention of the underground labyrinth, but there are still those who, during the night, approach the cathedral and walk silently over the slabs of the visible labyrinth, convinced that beneath their feet, the other one still beats. That, although hidden, it remains active, and that its secret geometry still exerts a subtle influence on those who step on it, even without knowing it. The labyrinth beneath Chartres is not a ruin. It is a system, a living structure, a coded language written in stone and void. And perhaps its greatest power is not in what it contains, but in what it suggests. That beneath every truth, there is another, older, more serpentine, waiting to be traveled, not with the eyes, but with the soul. That there are paths that do not lead to a destination, but to a transformation. And that some temples were built not to worship, but to contain. And what Chartres contains still breathes. You have traveled 3 hours through darkness, secrets and truths that perhaps we should not have remembered. Whether all this was real or not, no longer matters. What matters is what now lives in your mind. Because once the door to mystery opens, it never fully closes again. Thank you for crossing it with me. Rest well, if you can. Good night.